right, Arsalan is here. Thank you for logging in, Arsalan. We're just going to start off now. And can you hear us? Everybody can hear us fine?
Yeah.
All right. Okay. So, Assalamu alaikum and welcome everyone. To those that celebrated, I hope you had an excellent and safe Eid this time around. My name is Hussein Adeem and I'm the Executive Director of Stratcom at IPRI. I'm very excited about hosting today's event for actually two reasons. One, we are launching G5 Internet Observatory, which our team has worked really hard for the last 5 months to start up. I'll be taking a moment. I'll be talking about this thing a little bit in more detail in a moment. And the second reason why I'm excited is because we have one of the very diverse and accomplished panel to talk on a subject that is almost very critical, not just to the global policy, but also for Pakistan. I would like to take a minute to thank and introduce our very accomplished panelists. Let's start off with Dr. Aslan Khalid, who is the Prime Minister's focal person on digital media and a seasoned professional on the subject. Amber Shamsi, who's a seasoned journalist, a very familiar face on TV, and who's working in the front line of action when it comes to disinformation, social media space, and also on in terms of how it impacts the journalism and the journalist community. We'll be talking to her a lot about her work in this session. And I also have with us our friend Emerson Brookings, who is at Atlantic Council and studies the subject through a very scholarly lens. He's leading one of the projects at DFR. It's something that I follow his work regularly, and I think most of us over here are very well accustomed with his work. I would like to thank you all for taking out the time to be part of this session today, specifically because it's 7 p.m. in Pakistan and we're still recovering from the Eid holidays. So thank you all for that. Before I start, I would like to bring your attention to three key data points. And I think we will then have a conversation around those data points, something that might be interesting for you to know as well. If you look at very closely, 15 years back, there wasn't much social media in Pakistan. There was no Facebook. Facebook was barely there. There was no WhatsApp. Even 10 years back, WhatsApp was still very, very new and it was still developing. Now, fast forward to 3 years back, there was no TikTok. The point I'm trying to make is that in just last 3 to 5 to 7 years, there is so much that has changed in terms of the digital media and how it is impacting the state, society, politics, policy, journalism, and every subject that is very important to us. We want to focus a lot more on this subject today to figure out exactly what the impact is and what the impact will be in the future. So that is one data point that is very important for us to look at. Sometimes we're so deeply involved in the day-to-day subject that we actually forget that just past decade, there was none of these issues that were there. And if you want to call it issues or the possibilities. The second data point is something very interesting that we did last year. There's one very small study that we conducted with the policymakers. The results of the studies were very, very important because it revealed that an average usage of social media by a policymaker in Pakistan, we took a sample of 25 MNAs and MPAs, was 4 hours and 35 minutes every day, including the users of WhatsApp and YouTube. Now, the impact of that is enormous because if social media is the key data point for the policymakers to consume information, then we're essentially talking about influence from if we want to call an echo chamber or very selective information based on the algorithm that is developed. So the connection with the public, which may seemingly be there, could easily be manipulated through bot activities and all for the policymakers to start developing policies based on not the actual data, but the data from social media. So, this is something that we're going to talk in this session as well extensively. And I think I will talk to Arsalan about this more deeply as well. The third thing, which may be relevant to Emerson, and I think I would like to have more conversation on that, is one data that we recently did a couple of weeks back, which is very important. We looked at the numbers that were being produced recently when there was a TLP fiasco in Pakistan, Tehreek-e-Labbaik. There were protests against the French government and the French ambassador. TLP was running almost 2 or 3 different trends in Pakistan, 5 days consecutive, churning out over 2 million plus tweets with an impact and traction of over 100 million. Unabated. A lot of that content was very violent. A lot of that content was very extremist, but the Twitter allowed that content to happen. It allowed that content to take place without, and I do believe that the government of Pakistan was trying to take it down, but it was allowed to take place in that way. And then we saw a couple of deaths in Pakistan because of the protests, and how social media became a weapon for a very small group, TLP, to be able to exert its power. The policy impact and the human cost involved, I think we'll be discussing that more with Emerson. It is these three data points that I wanted to bring out, because that set the context of why we are launching G5IO as a research team, to understand the anatomy and impact of social media space on democracy, human rights, state, and human behavior in the digital world. So G5IO is essentially that, and I'll talk a little bit on that. Again, it is also in the same context that we are hosting this webinar today with a diverse panel from the policy community to the journalism community and to the scholar community, to better be able to understand and gauge where we're going to be heading with that. Let me just pull up one slide that I have for G5IO to be able to better bring out. Let me see. I'm always mess up this. Let's figure it out. The share screen is never a good idea. Yeah. Can everybody see the screen?
Yeah, we can.
All right. So G5 essentially is part of IPRI that we have recently, in the 5 months we've been working on. The idea is very simple. How can we harness the power of data, analytics, and insights to be able to understand the deeper nuances of the digital space? How can we understand how the digital space is evolving and its impact on fragile democracies, fragile underdeveloped countries like Pakistan, and what impact could it have on the minorities, what impact it could have on women rights in the country, and what impact could it have for the policymakers in terms of their decision making. So we're combining, what we essentially did was that a team of data scientists at IPRI sat down with a team of behavioral scientists that we hired to essentially do the following objectives. One, our key goal with this is mapping and understanding the digital behavior. Right now, I feel that digital media has been active for the last decade, but more robustly in the last 5 years. But we truly don't understand what is organic and what is bot activity. What narratives are actually the voice of the public, and what narratives are being manufactured by the state, by the actors, by the networks, by the fringe groups, and how that is impacting the policy decisions and the impact of that is happening. The second very important thing, and that is very personally close to me, is tracking disinformation, misinformation, and fake news. A few years back, without naming any specific groups, there was an event that happened in Jhelum where fake news essentially became a wildfire through religious groups and everything from Facebook, and a mob gathered to then burn out a factory and industry owned by a minority community in the country. Now, that was the military had to be called in and deployed to ease off the situation. A lot of situations like this, when we talk about the blasphemy issues, are around the idea of fake news. So the social media has given a new way for the extremist groups, any individuals, to be able to then act upon hate with endings that are actually very effective. So this is one of the areas that we want to understand how disinformation travels, how disinformation gets mushroomed, and what can be done to eventually stop that. So that's one of the second objectives, which again tags with the monitoring and extremist and hateful content, because I think social media is a good reflection of the state and society. I do believe that it does reflect a lot of public pulse, but at the same time, since digital media does not have any borders, it is open to platform manipulations from outside forces, from inside forces. So seemingly a very benign force could have a large impact through a chaos theory by implicating certain issues and exaggerating some issues in a society, to be able to then cultivate polarization. And I think we saw that in the United States, and Emerson could talk a little bit more in detail on that. again, with some of these things, we also want to, we're really interested, our team is really interested to look at how the evolution of information in digital space is happening. I do believe that digital media is still a very primitive, in its very primitive stages. We don't know where it is going to land. So we need to be able to prepare and understand and track and be able to then navigate as well how the state, which has been present for the last, since the Westphalian world order, how the state then adjusts itself to the new digital reality. Shutting it down is not the answer, closing it down, censoring it is not the answer, but what does state then have as an option? So that is something that we want to also look at. Innovation in digital technology is something also we want to do. The last thing we're really interested to do is, because I don't think you can do digital media sciences and data analytics in silos. You have to collaborate. You have to collaborate not just locally but globally as well, with think tanks that are doing excellent work, that the academics that are doing excellent work, to be able to then understand this new field. Because, and I think we'll discuss that in a more detail, the way we look at social media and its impact in Pakistan are very different to how somebody in Australia who is studying that looks at. So there has to be some connection in the bridge between the two, so be able to find a right balance between how Twitter is behaving, for instance, in Pakistan, and whether Twitter or any social media platform is discriminatory against the former colonies and the former third world countries. So those are certain issues I think can be bridged between a very close collaboration. And we're very interested in having collaborations with DFR, the Stanford Internet Observatory, where we are also getting connected as well. So that's the core objective that we have. Now, what are we doing as a product? We have very simple, straightforward goals on that. One, we, as part of the IPRI, which is the national part of the Pakistan's government national security division, our interest is very simple. We want to provide actionable policy input to the government to be able to navigate this space effectively without creating a mess. Because a lot of times the policy makers, and Arsalan would probably have better things to say about that, the people in the policy decision making are not completely fluent with the digital media space, which is why sometimes the laws and the legislation and the policy that comes out is effective, is actually counterproductive. So IPRI would like to be a bridge between the academia, the scholarly world, the journalist community, and also with the younger lot that is using the digital media space, to be then able to take that voice for the policy consumption and be able to influence policy based on that. Second, we do also want to collaborate with Facebook and other organizations, social media platforms, for ethical and good use of social media. I think that is very important. I don't personally think that social media can be effectively made normal by just legislation or by running some sort of policy action. I do think it has to come organically, with more aggressive campaigns on digital literacy, more aggressive campaigns on digital education and all of that. So with G5IO, we would like to understand the social media space, partner, and be able to then produce something which can effectively make social media a safer environment for all stakeholders that are involved. And this is exactly the type of conversation that we would like to have today. And I would love to have any input you have on our little project that we're doing over here. Very humble project, but this is one of the first labs that we've set up in Pakistan at any think tank. So it has a very promising future, and we look forward to your input as well. So I'll end the conversation on G5IO, and I would get straight to the webinar, where I have a lot of questions, and I'm sure we're going to have a really great conversation on that. I'm going to start, as you all know the format, there are no set speeches involved. We're just going to get straight to the question and answers. And if you have any prepared speeches, do please say the words on that. Emerson, I'm going to come directly at you, because I think the current times between the Palestine and Israel, and the way disinformation is going complete haywire in that context, I would like to start off with one thing. There is this sentiment within our parts of the world, and I would say that more or less in Pakistan, India, and elsewhere, that everybody is complaining that social media companies are inherently discriminatory. The government is not happy, the journalist community is not happy, the academics are not happy, the Indians are not happy, the Pakistanis are not happy. We've seen TLP, Tehreek-e-Labbaik in Pakistan, running malicious campaigns against minorities for weeks. And while the government does report those content to Twitter, the response, and I think Arsalan, when he give his comments, might be able to talk more on that. The response from Twitter is very lukewarm. It's like it allows certain things, and by neglecting, by not looking at that. My question to you is social media platforms and this space inherently discriminatory? So if you could start off in whatever you want to say in the start as well.
Gotcha. Hussein, thank you for the introduction. And very quickly, just thank you to the Islamabad Policy Research Institute for hosting this today. And congratulations on the launch of the G5IO, which I hope we'll be able to talk more about research methods and best practices there. But to your question, which is extremely salient, I'm going to try to represent, well, my understanding of the space as an American. This doesn't necessarily mean I'm defending everything I say, but this is my assessment. I would call the social media companies, if not discriminatory, then inherently reactionary, because they currently possess so much political power. When one is writing about them, one often sort of confuses them with governments, but they're not governments. These social media platforms, especially these Western social media platforms, are still fundamentally businesses. And the way, and practically, their job isn't making laws, it's making money and mitigating as much risk to their businesses as possible. And what is risk? Risk, first of all, is how much money you spend and how many resources you invest in content moderation. And the fact is that these services, which deliver content to hundreds of millions of people in wildly different cultural contexts around the world, the resources that they devote to policing their platforms are better than they used to be, but it's still a drop in the bucket. If you consider, for instance, that there are still nations in the world where something like Facebook is the predominant news source, yet there may be just a dozen sort of editors or people in charge of content moderation who are specifically versed in the cultural context of that country, effectively trying to police and monitor the expression of millions of users, which is not so much a workable system. And as I say that the social media companies are mitigating risk, they're also most concerned about regulatory risk. And the fact is that because these companies are based in the United States, they're concerned mostly about the US Congress, which can exert a direct regulatory pressure and which can threaten their core business interests. This is why, for instance, you've seen Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook testify repeatedly before the US Congress. And the questions from the US Congress are not always particularly good, and he's often saying the same things. But when they ask, he always goes. And you contrast that with numerous requests or demands from parliaments around the world in which Facebook has not been nearly so responsive. Is just one example. We have quite a close working relationship with the Canadian government, and they've expressed exasperation that they basically can't get these high-level social media representatives responsive to their requests. And then, of course, it should also be said, even beyond the business pressures, is just the fact that the third world and beyond the West, beyond English speaking and the sort of the Anglosphere, there's just far less resources invested in understanding cultural context and in constructing social media platforms appropriately. So I would not necessarily characterize all this as discriminatory, but it is reactionary. And it is a result of decisions made because these platforms are still ultimately businesses.
Thank you for that. I'm going to quickly go to Dr. Raslan for his point on that, because I do understand that he has dealt with the social media companies directly. And if Raslan, you could comment on this part, because I do understand that you've been interacting with social media companies as a Pakistan's policy representative. I think you're on mute. Arsalan, you need to unmute yourself. I can't hear you, sorry. Can you?
Hello, can you hear me? Sir?
Yeah, can hear you now.
Okay. So first of all, congratulations on such a brilliant initiative. I think G5IO will be a game changer, and I will let you know when we will be discussing it the second part of the webinar. First of all, on the topic that you discussed with Emerson, I still feel that social media companies are discriminatory. I agree to the point about that these have their businesses interest and everything, but I still believe that they are discriminatory. A perfect example is of the Trump accounts. I mean, Trump accounts, I'm not going into the merits or demerits of whether his account should be suspended or whether they should not be suspended. But the fact is that they were suspended for the reason that he was making accusations of election rigging without any substantial proofs. So the same happens in the third world every time. Take it to Pakistan or Bangladesh. Every time there is election, the losing party says that there is rigging, but never social media companies never take any action. They never suspend any accounts. So if they see it like that the Trump account or the accounts that were promoting the allegations of election rigging in US was a threat to democracy, that people will lose faith in the electoral process by that, then what about the democracy in Pakistan? We are already seeing the consequences of election rigging allegations, that every time somebody loses these election rigging allegations are raised. And we have just seen the example in Karachi elections that only 15% of the people just came to vote. So, and the other thing is the very important thing about the TLP thing, we reported uh, like hundreds of accounts we reported to Twitter. We also reported to Facebook. The fact was that Facebook was still listening to us. They were still blocking the content that were violating their community guidelines. But Twitter was even not acting on the accounts that were violating their guidelines. There was violent content shared. There was evidence of the bots activity, which by Twitter standards, they will always strike down any activity which is the bot activity. But still, there was nothing on it. So I personally feel that there is discriminatory behavior of the social media companies. Yes, I think there is shortcoming on our part. We should accept that. There is shortcoming on our, I think we still haven't been able to develop a system within Pakistan for better coordination with these social companies. And this we should work on. And as you said, that we shouldn't work in the silos. I mean, sometimes it's the PTA, sometimes it's the distributor wing, sometimes you people coordinate with them. But I think there is a disjointed effort on our part. Yes, but still, I feel that this is such a grave threat to Pakistan and so for the other region, because you see, Hussein, there is a deep connection of disinformation with the audience, with what kind of audience we have. And what I feel is that there is an organized activity going on social media where we are making our people more and more polarized. The TLP content that was shared, what they did was that they were exploiting the extreme opinions of certain peoples, and they were exploiting in those hashtags. And in such circumstances, any disinformation campaign, anything that is fake news, that is being targeted towards those audience, they tend to agree to that message more. So I think this needs to be taken very seriously. And whatever the, I know there is a whole debate of freedom of expression and everything, but I think this is something that social media companies need to realize, and they should work with not only Pakistan, but all other such governments and see the threat of this thing.
Thank you, Arsalan, for those point of view from the policy angle. Amber, I need to ask you about this specific subject because you've talked about disinformation, you've talked about social media platforms, and you are very active on that as well. do you see this social media companies and it as inherently discriminatory? But do you see there is a policy failure on our part as well? The reason why Pakistan is not taken seriously is because Pakistan does not carry the that very legitimate card of being, the state itself being very active and humane when it comes to human rights issues and all of that, which is why a lot of social media companies don't want to ingress in that. Do you see that it's a failure of our part, or do you see there is a larger problem at play over here?
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you so much for inviting me. I've always had a very keen interest in this. I've been tracking how politics and media, the spread of misinformation and disinformation, and in particular, how it causes harm. How you mentioned Jailam, for instance. Let's also talk about health issues for the polio campaign, or going further, TLP. Can you hear me?
Your voice is distorting a lot.
It's distorting a little. Can you hear me a little more clearly?
Yeah.
A little more clearly now?
You're good now.
Okay, all right. So this is something so this is something that's really important. I think your initiative is also important because globally there has been research mapping disinformation and misinformation, the impact that it has on society. In Pakistan, we talk a lot about it, but we don't have the data in order to back those claims. For instance, and I will come to the point of discrimination and the third world and Pakistan's record as well. But I think it's really important to point out, for instance, the Reuters Institute of Journalism did an exercise in how disinformation spreads, how it's viewed, whether it's considered propaganda, whether it's believed in India and Brazil, for instance. And astonishingly found that a lot of people, more people watch credible news or read credible news sources online rather than what are considered to be propaganda machines or propaganda posts. So I think that's very interesting. And I think that's why your initiative is particularly important. When we look at Facebook companies, we have to understand that society is keeping up with this acceleration of information bombardment, how to regulate. We're still dealing with all of this because it's happening at such a fast pace. I remember reading Thomas L. Friedman's book, The World is Flat. And the idea really obviously is that if things are happening so fast that governments are finding it hard to keep up. And imagine that we've been talking about the undue influence of social media on politics, on political spaces, on human rights. And we still haven't been able to resolve these issues where you saw on the 6th of January, for instance, the Capitol Hill insurrection, the QAnon conspiracy, even though all of these things have come up, for instance, the attacks against Hillary Clinton and Pizzagate controversy in the 2016 election. In Pakistan, well, for instance, Facebook and being responsible for inciting or at least allowing genocidal posts against the Rohingya Muslims. And they absolutely should be held liable for it. And different countries obviously are dealing with in different ways. One of the ways I've seen, and this is because of my own personal interest in how social media should be regulated, is engagement with social media companies. And I also know that, for instance, authoritarian or semi-democratic governments have a tendency to make requests that perhaps would not be seen kindly by social media companies. That is not to say that the government does not have a right, and absolutely it does. We have TLP is an example of fomenting hatred, inciting violence against minorities, against vulnerable groups. There is pornography as well, and the government has an absolute right. But we should also bear in mind that the government also looks to stifle dissent. And these things where they may be considered to be acceptable in Pakistan may not be seen as such. Then they don't follow the constitution of Pakistan. They don't see the qualifiers in our constitution in Article 19. So these are considerations that are absolutely correct. So Pakistan's history, the state's history of suppression, dissent, suppression of dissent, these are all things that perhaps if there was more engagement to take those hateful content seriously down would perhaps work more effectively. I think it's also interesting where we look at the capacity of the state to deal with these threats. So, for instance, I had a conversation with the PTA chairman, the Pakistan Telecommunication Authority, in the cyber wing. They don't have enough desks. Their connections with these Facebook companies is so remote that even if they're genuine online threats against women, against vulnerable groups, they're not able to get those taken down as well because they don't have those connections. So really, I think we need to think beyond reactive social media rules and regulations or fines. Is Pakistan in a position? Does it have the leverage? How do we increase the capacity? Because as you know, as all the panelists you have pointed out, these are grave and dangerous threats. We've seen these played out in various countries, whether it's India, whether it's Pakistan in terms of health crises and disinformation around polio vaccines or COVID-19, whether it's threats to life, whether it's individuals who are threatened, democracy, human rights. So all of those things, these are of great concern. There's a reason why it's called a disinformation pandemic or a disorder as well, information disorder. So I really think that data collected, an understanding of how this could be done, involving all stakeholders, which includes, for instance, political buy-in, which includes social media company engaging them instead of trying to come at them like you would somebody, you know, these are not Pakistani companies. We have to understand how the world operates as well. So really a careful think on how this policy should move forward with data is one of the ways I think that you could perhaps address this issue. And by no means has any country properly addressed this issue. You know, let's also be fair.
Well, thank you for that. I'm just going to have a follow-up question on that. But I remember Iqbal Ahmed wrote, Dr. Iqbal Ahmed, the late Iqbal Ahmed wrote this one paper, Terrorism, Theirs and Ours, where he essentially, the point was that one's man terrorist is the other man's freedom fighter. I recently was talking to somebody who runs these social media networks, and this is one of the conversation was that one person's truth is other person's disinformation, and so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
There's a very fine line. What I want you, and I guess from all the panelists, if you could probably to the audience explain in a very easy words, how do you define disinformation? How do you conceive it? And based on your basic essential positionality as a journalist, how do you see disinformation?
I mean, I think that's a very valid question because for one, because fake news has become associated, for instance, with former President Donald Trump. It has also been weaponized against journalists, whether it is in the US, whether in any other country where there have been populist or authoritarian-leaning governments. So I actually have a problem with that term. I prefer the sort of more UN mandated or acceptable terms, which are misinformation and disinformation. So fake news, as we understand it, and roughly, just as a rough definition, is where the information, whether it's in terms of sourcing, whether it's in terms of facts, is completely incorrect. There's no verified truth.
I think we're losing you.
So, can you hear me now? Okay, I'm going to try again. So misinformation is where somebody is it may be misleading, it may not be deliberate. Whereas disinformation is news or information that is for the purpose of propaganda. And I also would like to point out, so even within these, there are more nuanced understandings of misinformation and disinformation as well. So for instance, there could be a misleading headline. In some cases, a story where there may be the sourcing or the fact may be verifiable or authenticated, but the framing, the language may lean towards bias, for instance. That in itself, to my mind, is problematic, perhaps because it may be unbiased information, but that doesn't mean necessarily that it is disinformation. So again, there are nuances, the two definitions that we need to understand, because I really do have a problem with the word fake news because of its association and weaponization by Trump and other populist leaders, is misinformation, which is misleading, and disinformation, which is outright propaganda.
Thank you, Amber. I think that's very nice. Arsalan, government being on the highest form of power pyramid in any society, naturally, I've worked on both sides of the aisle. The government is essentially, I do believe, the biggest victim of fake news at times, because there are so many actors that are in play, and there are the state actors, the politicians, and the other institutions as well. And I do understand that within the government there is a certain sentiment against them, whether any government, this government, previous government, or the government before that, there's always a friction between the media houses. I remember back when we were growing up, Jung was notorious for its Urdu headlines, and any government, sitting government, would have a problem with that. And then later on, during Jan Musharraf's era, the electronic media, that was there. So there's definitely been tussle. And now social media, because it's so robust and it's so fast, how do you as a policymaker see disinformation and conceptualize it? So what's your essential definition of it?
So first of all, I think we have to look at disinformation thing very objectively. I mean, I was talking to somebody and he had a very liberal view about disinformation, that what can be called as fake news and what can't be. And his view was that if something is proven to be, I can quote you the example. Actually, I was discussing the case of the fake news where it was said that Saad Rizvi of TLP is released from jail. It went viral. Dawn was the first one to print it in their edition, and then everybody actually tweeted and everything. So I was discussing this topic with it, that how will put this news in what category. So he had a very liberal view about it, and he said that we can't call it fake news. And I said, why? And he said that journalism, if you start to call these things as fake news, where the source was proven to be faulty, the source was the one who actually quoted it wrong, then how can we give news and what sources we can quote? So he had this point. But then uh, where will it stop? If something is proven to be false and it was rebutted immediately and he's still not been released from jail, so if we can't call that a fake news, what is fake news then? So we have to look at things very objectively, and I think now there is I think the study conducted by Claire of the first draft, and he has given 7 types, where anything that misleads, anything that manipulates, anything that can be taken as something painting out of context picture, or as Amber pointed out, false headlines having nothing to do with the stories. I think these all things are types of disinformation. And obviously, even the clickbaiting that is being common practice by the YouTubers and everybody, where the whole story is different, and on the thumbnail they are going to paint something as something else. So I think all of this counts in disinformation. But my point is something else. I think there should be, while we look at this whole thing very objectively, we have to discriminate between an ordinary social media user and people who sit in government offices, people who are considered as responsible people, who public expects them to be very credible, and anything coming from them should be very credible. Like, there are social media influencers with thousands and thousands of accounts, and if they are going to say something, they should do it when they are 100% sure of something. You can have a research conducted on it. There's tens of pieces which can fit in the disinformation category every day. But which one makes the impact? The only one that makes the impact is that when a journalist picks it up and he tweets or further retweets or publish it somewhere, or a political leader starts to retweet it. Every political leader, whether it's from the ruling party or from the opposition, every political leader has thousands and thousands of followers. So if something is coming from a political leader, people just follow, people just make it viral. So I think if where we talk about regulation and everything, I think the most important thing is about self-regulation, self-accountability. That am I going to do something which is going to pose some threat to public? Like I can put you numerous examples. I can put you an example of a seasoned journalist, and in 2019 he said that dollar is going to touch 200. It's 2021. It's 2021 today, and it hasn't touched dollar hasn't touched 200. So at that time, what it did was that it immediately there was a panic in the market. People start hoarding. I think these are the things that actually that actually play with. It's not about politics. It has far more reaching effects than just politics. So I think we need to be very when we talk about disinformation and everything. I think we need to also look at the aspect that we need to self-regulate and help and hold ourselves responsible in certain things too.
Thank you, Ursulana. I think you mentioned one point about this, the conversation around dollar reaching a global point, and I feel there is a very fine line involved. That could be one person's assessment or opinion based on whatever data they have done, right? So it turned out wrong. There you go. How do you distinguish the fine lines between the opinions that are genuine? Is there an element of intention involved in disinformation? I'm going to come to Emerson to talk about it. Emerson,
Hossein,
okay.
just wait. You are absolutely right. I mean, one can have his views. One can have his. I totally respect that. And if he had just said that according to my opinion, it's just addition of a few words before telling something, it can have an entirely different meaning to it. Because when you come on TV and you give it as a news, people are going to take it as he had some kind of inside information. He had some kind of information from the government or something. So if he just say that according to my view, or he can say I had talked to economists and everything, and he had quoted some economist, it had an entirely different meaning to it. So this is my point, that you can't just when we talk about disinformation, I think there are categories. Yes, sometimes it's absolutely a false thing being propagated, but sometimes even when you propagate your opinion as news, it's still disinformation.
Okay, so I want to come back to that later when we talk about a little bit about digital media ethics and digital behavior, because I think this space is still so new that a lot of our countries and the global society is finding their footings on how to operate, behave on the social media front. Emerson, disinformation has been there since Socrates, so it's not anything new. What has changed then that this has become so important? And how do you define, I think the question really is, how do you define disinformation in the digital context? And is that different now than it was, for instance, from the electronic media or for print media? So if you could comment on that.
So the the difference today is speed. The fact that a false claim can reach tens of millions of people in the space of an hour. And then also the fact that with previous media technologies and means of broadcast, even when there was a false claim, it was also easier for counterclaims to reach that same audience. If you think about a sort of classic editorial process, even when someone might be putting together a story where there was a claim, one would also seek out voices that had a differing opinion. And those two things would be presented generally in the context of the same article. So they'd reach the same viewership. And that just doesn't happen today. There can be an unsubstantiated claim that reaches a lot of people. And even if it's false, even if it's provably false, and there's a proper fact check that goes on, that fact check, we now have the information on this, it tragically reaches far fewer people. So most people will never be disabused of their original notion. So when we talk about disinformation, we define it as false or misleading content intended to deceive. And that element of intentionality is very important because you're not going to police or get rid of all of the false information on the internet. Instead, you're looking for cases in which the individual who started the rumor knew better, and they were trying to achieve a particular objective in spreading that content. And even then, we also, as I think Arsalan correctly alluded to, not all disinformation is created equal. You have to prioritize things that are spread by people with big platforms, and then particular content, especially content that invokes outrage, which can very quickly translate into violence or to sort of imminent harms against the broader society. And but when we actually try to identify disinformation, or when we try to put measures in place to guard against it, the fact is it's very difficult to prove intentionality at the time. Because you unless you're in a foreign intelligence agency or something like that, you typically aren't privy to the internal conversations or planning of people who are conducting these campaigns. So what the research community and civil society does when they're trying to identify disinformation campaigns is look for evidence of orchestration of what Facebook calls inauthentic coordinated behavior. But your botnets or your social media accounts that seem to be false personas. And when you can identify and prove that these inauthentic networks have been established and they all in concert were promoting certain false claims, then you have pretty good evidence that that is a disinformation campaign. And I also just want to echo and endorse what Amber said regarding these broader, less helpful definitions, especially this fake news. The fact is, and something that we continually grapple with, is governments around the world have become more cognizant of the disinformation challenge, which they typically refer to as fake news. They also try to legislate against it, sometimes quite aggressively, sometimes in ways that greatly imperil freedom of expression in a democratic society. And that unfortunately, many government countermeasures against disinformation can often look, a lot like censorship or abridging or getting rid of what should be sanctioned political expression. So that's always something to be very careful of when we're having this conversation.
Quickly with you on that, and I think I would like to have the panel's view on this as well, since we're on the subject. In terms of the state or in terms of the society's response to disinformation, legislation or actual investment in digital literacy, or both? How do you see this thing? What is, and I'm sure this is going to be different for different countries as well, but how do you curb this thing? Because there's a debate constantly where, for instance, in Pakistan, there is much more emphasis on bringing on harsh rules or regulations, which I don't think personally can ever work for this specific space. It's just going to drain the government out, add more pressure and all. Digital literacy is a longer route. It's a painful, painstaking task. How do you see in a society like the United States, which is seemingly educated, more digital literacy and all, but essentially the problems Pakistan and the US face are essentially the same in many ways in terms of the disinformation and polarization. So your comments on that?
So our response to this question, I think, will be grounded in the different speech norms and national context, but that's fine. And I will look forward to other perspectives here. But in the case of the United States, our First Amendment places political expression is inviolate. And with very rare exception, that norm, even extremely harmful and anti-government expression, has generally been upheld as appropriate in a democratic society. And as I alluded before, social media changes this simply because these false or injurious claims can reach many more people at once and can often bring about real world violence and harm to an extent that wasn't the case before. When I think about what US government should do with regard to disinformation, I don't think it's the government's role to legislate on specific content. You can't say this thing online or this thing is false. Instead, I think there has to be a stronger approach to looking to the rights of victims of disinformation, people who've suffered palpable harm because of false claims. Give you an example. There was a conspiracy theorist in the United States. His name is Alex Jones, and he spread many conspiracy theories. And for a long time, there was a debate over whether he should be removed from social media platforms. In particular, he spread conspiracy theories about a 2013 mass shooting in the United States that killed 23 elementary school aged children. And he spread conspiracy theories that this shooting was false and that the parents who lost children were all paid actors. As a result of the things that he spread, these parents came under immense and sustained harassment campaigns that they sometimes feared would turn violent. Now, horrific as the things that Jones said were, if I'm looking at this from a US perspective, I don't want the government to say flatly that one cannot say these things. What I want to do is to give legal recourse and power to the victims of those campaigns who could have sued Jones for injury and who could have pressed and asserted their own rights in this case. And unfortunately, the parents tried again and again. And I think recently they've seen some success, but they suffered this for years without any recourse because of the construction of the US legal system. And that seems to be changing a bit. But in general, I think that's the appropriate role of government here, even as the social media companies take more aggressive steps. Regarding media literacy, look, I think the success of such programs would vary widely by nation. It is an irony that the US has essentially unlimited resources to educate and inform our own population. But Americans are extremely distrustful of any government-led information literacy initiative. So I think it would have limited utility. And one final observation for just, if you look at government regulations in another context, Britain, which has a united and much more powerful history of regulating both political discourse and information systems. British government just announced a new policy, which will be implementing, and the operative language is that platforms must take down harmful content. They have an obligation or else they'll be fined, while leaving up democratically important content. That's the actual language, harmful and democratically important, but these things are not defined. They are left to the companies to try to figure out how to implement it. And then if they don't do a good job, then the British government throws that regulation into action. But it sounds great. But what those sorts of regulations are essentially doing is pushing this democratic responsibility entirely onto social media platforms and just instituting harsher penalties if they don't do what the governments in retrospect wish that they had.
That's very interesting, Emerson. I'm going to ask one last question before we start taking questions from the audience, because I'm flooded with that right now. But I'm going to take the liberty to ask one last question. You raised a very interesting point about Alex Jones, and I've studied the entire conspiracy theories. I've been a very active guy as well. Amber, the question is to you and Arsalan. This idea of the freedom of speech and freedom to do propaganda, I feel that I sit on two sides of the world in Pakistan, the policy side and friends of the media houses and the academics. There's polarized debate on that. What's the line? What's the line over here? The freedom to say, but where does it stop? Does it have a particular limit? Or in a society like Pakistan, where the context, the environment, everything is so different, how do you conceptualize this specific problem? For instance, in the case of Alex Jones, somebody spreading conspiracy theories, we see that happen all the time over here from every corner. I'm not going to blame the journalists only. Any YouTuber, anyone who wants to get traction, there is that quick TRP to just call out anything and then essentially get the level of traction that you're looking for. How does media houses, since you've been involved over there, I would like to know that as media official in media houses, how do you essentially conceptualize this problem? I can't even articulate it correct, but I should.
Okay, so there's three ways of looking at what you asked, and it's a tough one. For one, we know that Pakistan freedom of speech and expression is enshrined in the constitution. However, there are qualifications about defamation against the armed forces, judiciary, etc., all of those things. Now, when we apply this to social media, we also have to recognize that they are it's a very broad, the constitution needs to be interpreted. It needs to be interpreted by the judiciary. And every judge obviously has a certain leaning. So some would perhaps, we've seen this in multiple cases. Some would have a more liberal bent, more pro freedom of speech or democratic bent. Others would not be so. And it really depends on which court they sit in, where they've come from, which high court, whether it's the Supreme Court. So the interpretation has been left to judges, which is at least more acceptable than if you look at, for instance, the social media rules and regulations, or PICA, which is meant to sort of monitor or criminalize these things which came out in 2016. So do we let, for instance, the Pakistan Telecommunication Authority, an official who may not be so well versed in all of these issues and law and justice, and make that determination? I think that's also problematic as far as I'm concerned. It gives a lot more power to people who may not understand the nuance, or who may not understand the impact or the consequences of what they're doing. So at least if you're going to have a broad definition, when you come to laws that are based off the Constitution, they should not be in contravention of the Constitution. That is your, the blueprint or the foundation. And even if they are based on the Constitution, at least make those definitions specific. So the problem comes when they are vague and unspecific, and that is when it becomes a problem, when somebody in the FIA cybercrime wing, or somebody in a police station, or somebody, a high court judge who may not understand what freedom of speech is, would interpret it his or her way, and that's a problem. So that's one thing. The other thing is, and I think I would completely agree. So I obviously believe, and Arsalan also spoke about this, and I'd like to expand on it. So we do know, as journalists, newspapers get it wrong. There are newspapers all over the world, for instance, who will publish a corrections box, or under the website, they update their story as well if there's a correction to be made. So it's all part of the record. It's transparent. If you make a mistake online, acknowledge that, make that correction. Why? So while governments or the state may have problems with false news and misinformation, or maybe even disinformation, if a journalist loses his or her credibility, who's going to believe him or her? So, for instance, Dawn, that Arsalan mentioned, also has at least a corrections page, and you may disagree with it. The idea then is, how do you ensure that those lines, as you said, are not crossed? I think there is a defamation law in Pakistan. Maybe that is where you should look at, instead of trying to regulate or undermine credibility or label journalists, because there are journalists who will get it wrong, and some deliberately so. If you strengthen the consequences of liability in terms of definition, I think that's a better way to look at it. And journalists whose credibility is undermined, nobody would believe them anyway. So there is a responsibility of journalists to make that correction, media organizations to make that connection, but also governments to tread very, very carefully as well. I'd like to also add another point, and I know that this is, and it's understood in Pakistan, just there as there is very, very, very partisan media in the US. There are obviously media houses or media organizations that have a particular bent, have a particular idea. I think if people are smart enough to know that if they're getting their source of information from various sources, not just one channel, not just one newspaper, not just from one journalist on Twitter, you can accept the bias, you can accept the leanings, because there are business interests, there are political interests involved in the major media organizations. And that's par for the course, that's fine.
Amar, thank you. I think that was very comprehensive, very insightful. Arsalan, I'm going to ask you a very tough question, and I apologize upfront for that. Uh, the current government is blamed a lot for its very active and reactionary responses to a lot of news and a lot of journalists and their point of views, to a point where it makes people uncomfortable that the government is very reactionary and is very insensitive at times. I do understand from a particular perspective as well that the government is fighting too many battles and all, but the government is blamed, and this one specifically, for its mismanagement of media, mismanagement of social media, and being too hyperactive when it comes to fake news, and essentially calling everything that does not suit the particular government's narrative as disinformation and all of that. I want your comment from the position where you sit and trying to help us explain this specific issue, because is there any, I mean, I'm not going to ask you if there's any truth to these claims, but what's the thought process that happens, that goes around when it comes to dealing with the issue of disinformation, or when you see a particular journalist or a media house giving wrong numbers on something as serious as COVID, which we saw happening a lot at the end. So comments on that.
And it's very unfortunate. I mean, to be very honest, I mean, this is very unfortunate that media looks at the government at this way, and there are obviously within the government, there is some kind of serious, I mean, there's serious concerns about the media role, about how sometimes they went overboard with the criticism. I mean, nobody in the government minds criticism. I think it's the problem starts when let's just leave aside the media thing, because it's something that I'm not privy to comment on, because Fawad is the information minister, he's dealing with the media houses. Let's just comment on the social media. And I think there is a great bit of criticism on social media that whenever a journalist criticizes the whole army of PTI, not government, whole army of PTI just starts bashing them and say, because then it's not like that. There is no organized campaign. There is nothing like no instructions are passed on to just go and attack somebody. It's not like that. The problem is that if you just go through the TL of many journalists who have their bias, and I respect that bias. If somebody has an opinion about the government, they think that government isn't performing, I respect that. There's no issue there. But just go to what they print in their papers, what they say on the TV, that's an entirely different version of them or what they do on the Twitter. On Twitter, they are hostile. On Twitter, they don't care if they are promoting fake news. They don't care if they are retweeting fake things. The reason for this is that they feel that on the platform of whether it's print or TV, they are accountable to someone. But what they are doing with the digital space is that it's their account, it's their personal account. Okay, we are just promoting if it proves to be wrong afterwards, nothing matters. What that has done is that it has created the whole PTI people, or they are taking them as an opponent party. They are not taking them as they are just being considered as somebody, Mariam Aurangzeb. They are not differentiating between that. There is a difference between Mariam Aurangzeb or Hamid Mir, because both their TLs on Twitter sometimes tweet the same thing. And there are many occasions where we can actually, you can also see that particular news was tweeted from a particular fake news was tweeted from an opposition member, and then 7 or 8 members of the media just tweeted it on this. So there is a feeling in the social media activist side and PTI social media people that these are the people who are against us, and that's why they are promoting fake news. So there I agree with Amber. What can be done is that even if there is a mistake by some journalist, if somebody has quoted something and that turns out to be wrong, what they can do is that simple, just delete the tweet and just accept it. Just accept that, yeah, you made a mistake. Obviously, there's a competition within the media to be the first one to break some news. So if that's the case, just accept the mistake. And to be very honest, if these simple things are done, that will go a long way. People will start trusting these journalists back. They will say, this shouldn't be a matter of ego that if I had tweeted something, I'm going to stick by it. I'm not going to delete it. I'm not going to apologize on it. If you can do it on the print, why not on social media? Why, as a social media user, I feel hurt? Because on print and electronic, you are concerned about the credibility, but you're not concerned about the credibility of social media. People, if such disinformation is so prevalent on social media, known figures with verified accounts are going to tweet total fake stuff there. So people are going to lose the credibility of social media. People are going to say that, oh, okay, we are just going to trust by what's on print, on what's on TV, and after it goes to editorial controls, here there is no control, there is no regulation over there, so I can't trust any news coming from social media. So that's something that's hurting the credibility of not only the journalists themselves, but they are hurting the credibility of the medium itself, which is painful.
Amber, I'm going to let you respond to that, but I'm going to ask you one tough question as well, just to be fair on all sides. There is this sentiment that is there, maybe in the echo chambers or something, that the journalists or anyone, I'm not going to say specifically journalists, but a lot of times people with big influencers, with big profiles, tend not to take criticism in a healthy way. And anything that goes against their opinion, they discredit that as trolling, troll farm, fake account, and all of that. Do you think, and I'm going to come to Emerson with that question as well, that are we really prisoners to our own echo chambers over the past 5 years? Have we become prisoners to that, whereas the algorithm is essentially not allowing us to be able to connect, and this polarization is there? So your comment on this whole issue of, is everyone a troll who doesn't agree with you?
Yes, well, I mean, if journalists are sensitive to criticism, all governments are very, very sensitive to criticism. This isn't just the PTI, which is in power at this time. The People's Party was heavily criticized on the media. This is, when social media was just, in its infancy stage at the time in Pakistan. The PMLN was heavily criticized and was also a target of a lot of misinformation and disinformation. I saw lots of posts that were masquerading as, I don't know, some foreigner, some foreign sounding name with a large post, and those were circulated on WhatsApp and social media. So to say that only this particular government or this particular party is facing a hostile press is, I think, incorrect, or maybe it's a forgetfulness of history. Anyway. In terms of echo chambers, I do agree with you. So what also happens, and I will also say, given that I have also experienced trolling and trolling campaigns, but I've also made the effort of tracking and tracing and documenting who trolled me, what their origins were, where they were coming, and what their connections were. And here's the problem. A lot of those were people who had multiple accounts or had particular profiles. As a journalist or as a working person, I may not be able to investigate it, but I think it is up to the government in power to provide, journalists security, and that comes with online harassment as well. They should investigate. For instance, online harassment and online trolling is not just a problem in Pakistan. It isn't just a problem of, and I will say this, it isn't just a problem of one political party. It's a globally recognized issue that the UNESCO has taken up. I mean, they recently published a report on how vulnerable communities, that includes women journalists, for instance, or minority communities, are subject to trolling and harassment, and what impact that has on their freedom of speech, as well as their career prospects and lives. So this is not just a Pakistan problem. It is a global problem, but it is very, very acute in Pakistan. So that's one thing. I think the problem when government representatives or state representatives tackle, and I would agree with Arsalan, there are several journalists who have biases. Every human being has biases, which may be more apparent in social media than it is on their media organizations or channels or whatever, wherever they're publishing or broadcasting their work. it may be more apparent. Social media tends to bring out that kind of sort of side of you, the perhaps where you think you can get away with more, which is not correct. But then does the state or do government representatives react the same way to journalists? And I've seen this as well, who may have, post some kind of misinformation slash disinformation that is favorable to the government and did not correct it. Or I've seen several, again, journalists, bloggers, who actually, it's the same bot-like activity. It isn't just journalists who may be favorable to another political party, but favorable to the ruling party with the same kind of language or same story. And it's, going, so have they addressed this? Do they look at that? That is the problem with government intervention in tackling disinformation or misinformation like this on social media, because unless it is seen to be balanced, unless it is seen to be fair, and I don't think any political party is able to do that, it's just not humanly possible, then you will have questions about authoritarianism, fascism, and conducting trolling campaigns. So I think that is why it's problematic. I think governments and political parties in power should refrain unless it's balanced.
Thank you, Amber. And I'm going to exactly take this conversation to you, Emerson. The echo chamber and how the algorithm is constantly evolving to show you only the stuff that you want to see, the people you want to follow, essentially reinforcing your bias over and over again. And I've seen in the last few years how the Twitter space, specifically in Pakistan, has polarized even deeper. So are we really digital tribes now? So this is more like a tribal culture in the digital space, where you have, for instance, tribe A, tribe B, tribe C with a particular view. I want to know exactly how you understand this, but because I know you have to leave in the next 10 minutes, how do you foresee the digital space evolving in the next, let's say, 5 to 10 years timeline? Would the tribe eventually come up into something else? Do you see more polarization? Do you see something else emerging out of it? Do you see the states in countries like Pakistan getting more destabilized? Because there is that destabilization going on, because the government cannot really cope up with the pressures that are facing from it. So echo chamber, digital tribes, and the future of how you see this entire space. And then I am happy to let you go.
So the easy questions. I would say something that we've observed throughout this webinar is that, social media hasn't changed the basic human behaviors. It's simply made things faster or exacerbated tensions that already existed. When we talk about echo chambers, they have the function of making you feel more confident, essentially, that your point of view is correct. Because at any point, if you're engaged in an argument or exposed to information you find troubling, you can basically return to the well and have your existing belief reinforced and find people who think and feel as you do, and be sure that your point of view is correct. On the fascinating point about, or question about government belligerence, and in general belligerence in the face of criticism, another concurrent trend, just as you're part of an echo chamber, you've also probably never been more exposed to the other side, if you seek it out, to trolls or individuals who hold a different perspective than you, and will sometimes be quite adamant in how they express their criticism of you. And that basically has the effect of it throws all proportionality out the window, basically, because this sort of criticism can trigger an immediate sort of emotive response, even if, and especially when it's not warranted. To give you an example for just people in the course of their personal social media use, maybe you share something on Instagram that you're very proud of. It receives a lot of likes. It seems like it's receiving a lot of positive engagement, but one comment, maybe the first comment, is negative. That will retroactively color your perception of everything else regarding that content. And it's going to be that single comment that's going to stick with you and make you angry. And I think that very personal example can basically be transposed to geopolitics writ large when we talk about the internet and about how internet has changed governance. A phenomenon I found fascinating in the United States was in 2017 and 2018, the Republican Party of the US controlled the White House, they controlled both halls of Congress, and they controlled the federal judiciary. But if you talk to an average Republican voter or looked at public opinion polling, Republicans had never been angrier. They never felt more beleaguered, never more under attack. And they held literally all the political power in the country. But the fact that there was another vocal minority online who were criticizing everything they had to say basically meant that they couldn't enjoy that power. And in fact, they felt like they had less power than they'd had before. So that's just sort of the way that social media criticism can make your perceptions drift so far from reality. As to the small question about the future of democracy in the world, I think what we're seeing already, but something that will accelerate, is a drift away from notions of journalistic institutions as, unfortunately, as objective sort of bastions of fact. If you look at the history of democracy in the United States in the 1800s, there weren't many newspapers or news institutions as we understand them today. Most of them were partisan newspapers, where you had a pre-existing partisan perspective and you paid to read people who agreed with you, essentially. You already knew what your beliefs were. You wanted them reinforced, and you were paying for that information. The invention of like modern journalistic norms is very much, I think, a function of the early 20th century and of the consolidation, and I'm thinking of US history here, but the consolidation of newspapers under a smaller number of more powerful publishing houses, of early radio and television, which were quickly monopolized by a handful of large networks. Suddenly, there were far fewer institutions that controlled broadcast to people, to most democratic citizens. And in that sort of environment, it became possible to institute some standards and norms. But I think folks will see where I'm heading with this, because social media makes everyone a potential broadcaster. Because the information that gains most salience in this system is that which is most attention grabbing, that which induces the most outrage. I think it erodes a lot of these news standards, and that democratic societies of the future may look in their information environments a lot more like those of the 19th century or before the invention of consolidated broadcast media. I still worry quite a bit about this future, because it will mean that we'll drift farther and farther from a shared objective reality. Social media uniquely raises the prospects of truly horrific violence and real world consequences for rapid spread of false information. But I do think ultimately this is the direction we're heading. And our job as we think about disinformation and policy is to understand we may not be able to arrest this slide altogether, but we should be thinking now about smart policy to help mitigate as many harmful effects as possible. And I'll stick around another few moments, but in case I need to leave early, thank you very much for inviting me here today.
My pleasure, Emerson. Amber, on the same exact topic, I need to pick up your brains on, so you've been a journalist for quite a while now. And if you look at the 1990s, with one state-run channel, PTV, 9 baje ka khabarnama, and newspaper next day, and the calm and the peace that was there in those days, I don't know if it was there ever, to 2000s and liberalization of media, where you have now the power move from the state to the media house owners, to the late 2000s when it moved towards the individual anchors that became more powerful or same level as the media houses, to then the broadcasters, like Emerson said. Now you have millions of broadcasters. A 16-year-old sitting in his bed criticizing the judiciary or criticizing the journalists, and taking that power away from 20 years back, from the state to the media houses to the journalists, now to the trolls, if you want to call that. I want to pick your brains on where do you see this evolving eventually, the journalism, the media, and the social media. How do you envision the future of this information space, if you have to?
Okay, that's a sort of very, I mean, how do I see it? Okay, I obviously wasn't a journalist in the 90s. I was too young, but I do remember, my father, my parents watching Khabarnama at the 9 o'clock news, and it was a false sense of security, and we know that. Newspapers, obviously, it really was, but newspapers big and had a limited audience, but they were very powerful, and they did some good work as well. We have a lot of great journalists, investigative journalists, who emerged from that time period. It's interesting to me where when we see the history of broadcast in Pakistan, for instance, I think it is almost in a sense comparable to the history of digital media in Pakistan, because it's new, 2002. That's not that long ago. I know that there's a generation that perhaps were very, very young at that time, but in the history of broadcast and journalism, this is very new. There were so many mistakes that the broadcast or television made in Pakistan because it was new and exciting, and ratings, and we can show everything live. And no, we should not be showing dead bodies live. I remember the Air Blue wala hua tha, the Air Blue accident, and there were journalists who were going into the site and showing people who did not know their loved ones had passed away in the flight or had no information, and they were showing their bodies, and very disturbing scenes, or bomb blasts. That obviously terrorism, when Pakistan was racked with terrorism, the kind of scenes that our television channels were showing, which should not have been shown without a delay. These things evolved. I'm not saying that it's perfect, but these things did evolve. There was some kind of self-regulation, because I really don't think states should intervene in that sense, because states always tend to lean towards protecting itself rather than protecting citizens or media houses. But anyway, still evolving, still problematic. So in that same sense, social media, digital platforms, I think it's also interesting. I don't have the numbers on me, but television revenues have gone down. Whereas now that we have this multiplicity of bloggers, YouTube channels on all kinds of subjects, whether it's current affairs, whether it's analysis, whether it's food, whether it's tech, their revenues have gone up. And that's obviously the future. We're quite behind. You also see our traditional media houses, they haven't also kept pace. They're not training their journalists. They haven't, their idea of digital journalism is really taking what's on television and then pasting it on the website. That's not the way it works. So my problem, I feel that because of the financial problems that media houses have gone through, their own inability to evolve, their own business models, and I would also say financial sanctions that apparently came from the state or government. I'm not, I don't want to go into that in too detail. What it's done is it's hollowed out the industry and its ability to evolve. So when you destroy the credibility actively or not actively, or through their own work, obviously, it's hollowed out Pakistan's traditional media, and it's given space to social media to emerge, where there are fewer gatekeepers. There's even less training, and there's certainly, obviously, there seems to be in the future more money as well, and that to me is very, very worrying. I already see that, where there's a multitude of young journalists or aspiring journalists, or people with their own biases, who are quite sort of have become very popular in media. They've amassed large followings, which is great, except there is what Arsalan was complaining about, where people, how they behave on social media and how they behave on their channel. Those young aspiring so-called wannabe journalists don't have that kind of training behind them to back them, or any checks on them either from an editor. So that's what worries me, and I think that's where the future is in Pakistan as well. Another sort of where we're just sort of grappling with mainstream and its power. Digital is the future. Digital will have the money, and it will be unchecked, I'm afraid, and that worries me.
Thank you, Amber. I think that's very nice. Arsalan, I have an exactly similar question to you, but with slightly twist. Now, you represent that particular generation or professionals who have essentially built a career from social media. You're one of those people who have been able to accomplish a lot through the digital media space I mean, stuff that takes normal people decades to reach. Social media has allowed a fast track towards a particular new area and accomplishment on that. From that, how do you see the same tools that allowed that propulsion and that allowed that PTI government to essentially make power, which was otherwise impossible? Uh, how do you see that translating into, let's be a little bit more political, in the next elections, for instance? Because next elections are going to be very, very critical in Pakistan, not like previous ones were not, but the next elections, given the digital media space right now, given the polarization, given the overall society and the riggings and everything, how do you see the social media playing an active role? And is there a plan that you conceive for how best to essentially use social media at that point and to be able to mitigate that the problems that may arise, the ones we saw in the US recently? So if you could comment on that.
So we have actually, just like the mainstream media, I think when mainstream media started in Musharraf tenure, I think there were 2-3 channels, and when there are 2-3 channels, there's not a lot of competition, and so I think it went pretty much well till there is like 50 channels came there, and there was so much competition between each other, and then there was the race to come first. And then, obviously, as Amber mentioned about the business models, and I think many of the channels, the channel owners have just opened these channels for influence. I mean, they are not interested in to make much money out of them, and they are just there for the influence. So, I mean, there lots of things happened with the mainstream, and why it's in this state right now. So about the digital, it is also evolving. And what we saw was that when on the political sphere, since we were the first ones to come there, and we had the advantage of being the first one, and to be honest, there was no competition for us in 2013. So what we saw was that it was a very positive campaigning from our side. The sentiment was very positive. People were giving positive messages, and it was all very well till then. And then, obviously, when the opposition parties make their social media cells, and they had all kind of messages, so there, the mudslinging that was on the mainstream, it also came onto the social media. But one thing, Hussein, I'm telling you, it's evolving again. I mean, I'm looking at the data, and I'm telling you that in the last 1 year, people are not at all interested in negative things. People are not interested in to know that what's wrong with this country. People are want to know what's good with this country. They, when they log in onto their Twitter account, when they log on, and I'm talking about Twitter. On Facebook, it's still the messaging is still very confused there. But on Twitter, I think people are very much interested to know from the government that what they are doing. They are very interested to know from the opposition that what good you are doing about people. When you talk about stuff, are you talking about some greater good, or just talking about your cases and stuff? So I think there is a tremendous amount of disconnect in the conversation that people are expecting on social media, and the conversation that's happening on social media from the government, opposition, or from even the media side. There's a tremendous disconnect right now. And I think the sooner all of us realize that what people are expecting from us, how the mood is changing, how the more well-versed we will be in the next election, as far as we are concerned, I'm talking about, and about the anchors and everybody, etc. For their own good, I think they need to change the messaging. Yes, I mean, for momentary, if you talk about some negative stuff, you are going to gain followers, you are going to gain retweets. But then, if you talk about the impact, only the threads on Twitter that are well researched, only the tweets that are well researched that have data in it, they are the ones that are making impact. I think Hussain, you know better more than me, and if you just go through just last week, there is a guy who tweeted a thread about Israel Palestine and Fidato, you know him, and his thread has gone crazy viral just because there is no angling to it. He has just stated the facts. So I think social media audience now expect facts from the government, facts from media, and facts from all. And the sooner we realize, sooner we go towards that thing, I think the more well versed we will be in 2023.
Thank you, Ruslan. One final comment I need from both of you. We've talked about the polarization. We understand that there is that deeper problem that is there, the echo chambers and all. My last question and one comment I would like is, Amber, on your end, the journalist community, it's not specifically a question that you have to ask personally, and to you, Ruslan, as well. What are the efforts underway? How much are the two worlds talking, your world and the other world? Are there any bridges? Are there any conversations? Conversations like these, do you guys get to meet? Do you guys get to talk? Is there a forum? Is the government inviting? Are the journalists reaching out? If not, what's supposed to happen? Amber, if you can.
Okay. I think that the government does regularly invites the anchors and sometimes editors, and I believe some vloggers to interact with government officials. I am no longer actively involved in journalism, so I'm sort of out of the loop there. But when I was, we were regularly, there were briefings by ministers. Obviously, one of the issues there is, I think it's not just interaction that is, well, here's what we're doing, which is fine. But I think press briefings and press conferences, which this government also does. When you speak about engagement, I think the more important thing is, instead of attacking each other on social media, and I personally am very against, I really don't believe that there should be personal attacks, even if one slips now and again. There probably, we all have each other's phone numbers, for instance. There's WhatsApp groups that we share. I have shared one with Arsalan, for instance. It's probably better because we all have each other's numbers. Instead of attacking online and social media and trying to prove yourself superior, better, I think this is the kind of engagement that government representatives should do. It eases the sort of relationship. It makes it less combative as well. And there's more of an understanding of whether one is biased for the sake of bias. Not everybody's a lifafa journalist.
Arsalan, since you're part of the government, any initiatives on your end to actually bridge this divide? The polarization, I mean.
Yes, Hussain, actually, as Amber pointed out, there are regular sessions with, I obviously deal with only the digital media people, so vloggers are often invited, and similarly, many beat reporters now who have opened their YouTube accounts, so they are also invited. And yes, I agree with Amber. I mean, this is something that should be regularly done. Like, if there is a particular concern about a piece or that can be discussed about it. But here is my experience. I'm not talking about everybody, but here is my experience with a few. I mean, it's a very funny thing that when you talk about interacting with people, I'm more interested in how about forming the structure, or how can we proceed further. That there is no need for such personal interaction, that for every tweet or for every article one has to contact another person. Like, I won't name the person, but I had a very pleasant interaction with a journalist. And after second meeting, he asked me that I think it's time that my work should be promoted. I'm doing some great work, and I have softened down the tone and everything. So this work should be actually promoted, form accounts and everything. So this is something that I don't want to promote this. I mean, this is again something of a give and take. This is not a give and take, the kind of stuff that, okay, if you soften up, we will promote your stuff and everything. I think what Amber can help us in this matter also, that if we can actually have some kind of focus groups where actually we can, for instance, we can educate the journalist community and also the online community there, that how to move forward. What are the reasons why there's a gap between these two entities, and how we can coexist? I think this is something that is lacking, and this is something that we need to do.
Thank you, Arsalan. And I truly appreciate time from both you, Amber, and Emerson, who has already left. I'm just going to give a moment to Brigadier Rashid Ali Janjua, the acting president of IPRI, to give his concluding remarks. And thank you from my side. It was a pleasure to host the session.
Thank you for
Yes.
having us.
Thank you, Hussain. And a fascinating discussion. I think we all stand educated on a very important topic. I think here I'm reminded of Winston Churchill's famous quote that truth is so precious that it has to be protected by a bodyguard of lies. It just so happened that over a period of time, those bodyguards have swarmed the truth, and it's really difficult to ferret out what is truth nowadays. A very important aspects highlighted by all worthy speakers. Dr. Salan and Amber, who are both here, they pointed out the need to identify giving credibility to the narrative. I mean, on social media, a narrative gets traction if somebody credible is saying that. And as Amber said, that disinformation is deliberate peddling of the lies. In many ways, Emerson also, said the same thing when he said that there were networks which were acting as a community of interest. Now we all know these problems, and we know that social media is a reality. How best to regulate, whether we can regulate, whether we can adapt, whether we can be part of that echo chamber, or what possible advantages can we garner out of that echo chamber. I think that's the greatest challenge of today's mapping of this disinformation, ecosystem. And I think one aspect that I would have thought maybe for future discussion is opposite, and that is the accountability. Now, since social media has become a big player, and in many ways it approximates the power of the mainstream media in credibility, reach, financial benefits, all of those things. So why accountability is not there? And if the libel laws that are extendable to the mainstream media, if the same are extendable to social media, what kind of responsible behavior would we elicit out of that? And before we round up, and I finally thank the participants, we also need to be reminded that there was some time back a disinformation lab report, which was a portrayal of India sponsoring a 15-year-old media campaign against Pakistan through fake news and propaganda. We all know that network operated from Brussels, where Disinformation Task Force unearthed the website of a fake magazine for European Parliament called EP Today. EP Today and Times of Geneva both used content syndication with Voice of America and Russia Today to enhance their reach and credibility. It was also found that both Geneva and Brussels-based disinformation networks were linked with a number of fake websites, think tanks, and NGOs that were being managed by Srivastava Group in India. These investigations found additional 265 websites in 65 countries, named after extinct newspaper or spoof media outlets. Even an international lawyer who was long dead was impersonated and pressed into service of this disinformation. So I think at international law level, like I said, at national level, there should be some accountability level laws. There should be certain organizations at international level and institutions which should moderate this kind of irresponsible behavior. And on our part, we should have tools at national level to protect ourselves against the onslaught of this, bodyguard of lies around the truth, which is so elusive. So I once again thank the worthy past participants for a very enlightening discourse. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you all. Thank you, Amber. Thank you, Ursulan.